And there we are. We are live. Good evening, everyone in Chatland, whether you're joining us on Twitch or in Mattermost. Good evening to people watching via the HLS player or via the stream on Twitch. And good evening, Stephen.
Good evening, Graham, and all the other people that you mentioned.
Now, I am going to between finishing this and putting the replay online. I always push the create the show notes blog post, which is on a Hugo site. Copy it to the server, and then push a copy to the repository where so people can see the source of the website, and that repository is currently on GitHub. And one of the things I will be doing is moving that somewhere else. So obviously we can talk about where that somewhere else should be, and we've talked about like just running a Gitia or a GitLab or something like that, or using a clown service of the same. Those are all valid options. But we can also talk about why I might want to now move my source code away from GitHub.
We should talk about that. I want to add that as I've talked on this stream many times about my sort of 18-month rotation where I sell everything with an Apple logo on it and go all free software before, and that lasts for a duration of time before I end up going back. I have also made this switch off of and back onto GitHub several times and it's actually really quite relevant because it's for the same reason. GitHub is what everyone's using. It's sort of in a lot of ways a path of least resistance, and it enables freeness enough that it's not completely unreasonable for me to be conflicted about this. And every time I make the switch off of the Apple platform, it's because Apple did one more thing in the direction of pissing me off.
Right. So one more paper cut.
Exactly, and that is how I feel about GitHub. It's paper cuts.
Okay, so let's
we should talk about the latest paper cut.
Well, but let's let's sort of contextualize this and talk about the early paper cuts. So it's not just us saying here's this little thing, which is why we're throwing our desks up in disbelief and running away. It's like here's these other things. Now we have had a long history that we weren't able to participate in this year, but we have done in the last few years of whenever there is GitHub sponsored coffee at FOSDEM, we drink as much of it as we can.
Right.
In order to take GitHub's money. So, but there they are, effectively sponsoring one of the biggest, in fact, maybe the biggest free software conference in the world. I'm not sure whether it's bigger than OzCon, but it's almost certainly bigger than LibrePlanet.
Yeah, my understanding is that, well, because we don't really know, we know exactly how big OzCon is. We don't know how big FOSDEM is.
No.
But if the estimates from FOSDEM are correct, it would be the same size or bigger.
Right,
as
yes.
OzCon. I would say biggest in the world with an asterisk.
With dick fingers.
Right. You'll always say biggest with dick fingers.
Yeah. So like for me, this story goes back to like the inception of GitHub. Now, at the time, there were various Forge sites that were all not very good. In different ways. So there was definitely SourceForge was the biggest at the time, and it supported CVS, I think.
I think in the early days it was CVS only, and then they added Subversion pretty quickly after.
Yeah, so I I hand up for complete honesty and a disclosure and all that. I never particularly used CVS. There was one project I worked on that used CVS, and really like it was a sort of read-only place where some historical code was kept. You didn't have to deal with it. My first job I was a sysadmin, so I could get away with just using like RCS on sort of individual files, like config files. My first programming job, we had a what's that thing? a Perforce license, and then like Subversion was the thing that was quite popular. And so like whenever like SourceForge adopted Subversion, it was certainly sort of before GitHub became a big deal. But SourceForge's problem was the business model, because they were like very strongly sponsorship and ad supported. They did all sorts of weird like wrapping your downloads in bloatware and things like that at the time that made them quite problematic to use. There was probably Google Code existed at the time, and that was like new, and it was vaguely exciting because Google at the time was this new exciting company who were working out how to like make things for free on the internet and carry on existing. And so a lot of people,
and they still had "Don't be evil" as their main objective.
Yeah, absolutely. And people still believed that they meant that.
Right.
And so some people moved to Google Code. There was Savannah was the Free Software Foundation's sort of blessed platform, and actually it was all right. It had like project websites. It had
well, Savannah is a fork of the original SourceForge code.
Oh, okay, right. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, SourceForge was originally a free software project, and it only became closed sometime around when they got acquired by the company that acquired all of the nerd websites, like Slashdot and so on.
Dice, they were called, weren't they?
Eventually, before that, it was called something open source something.
Right.
But it changed hands a whole bunch of times. This was a political and just internet whinging before social media existed.
They had ThinkGeek and Slashdot and SourceForge.
Yep.
I think they're called SourceForge now.
My understanding of the
Matthew Scala is correct. OSDN, Open Source Developer Network.
Yes, OSDN. That's right. And my understanding of that, of the new SourceForge, is that somebody who cares more about free software than the previous owners bought it back and is trying to undo the damage.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
SourceForge is actually pleasant to use now. Again, but it just feels old.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, and that's the only thing with Savannah really, is that it feels old. It's like definitely Web 1.0, but it does all of the things that you would expect from modern platform, just not necessarily in a very well integrated way. It has like project websites, or project sites. It has project websites as well, so you can have like a web interface for your for your project. I think it does mailing lists, it does bug trackers, and it does patch management. If you do like diff in your local tool and create a patch, you can paste that into a form or upload it and send that to the project for review, and then they can adopt it, whatever. So that, it does all the things that we would expect. And like I guess Bitbucket existed back then and hadn't been bought by Atlassian, but that was one of the hot new things because that supported Mercurial. And what do you have any other sort of insight into what the landscape looked like? I guess Microsoft had their Team Foundation server. There was Perforce, which we already discussed.
Yeah, I used CVS quite heavily actually. And a lot of obviously my sort of introduction into source control and stuff like that was via the Debian project, and there were CVS servers for the Debian related things. And then when I got sort of my first go to an office, what I call a jobby job, I ran a community net, which is like an ISP, but it's free, and developed a bunch of websites for government, regional economic development related activities. And by that time, I had already been bitten by the version control bug, and so I ran my own CVS server.
Okay.
And I was very quick to, and I didn't actually use Subversion. I jumped from Subversion into distributed version control systems before we called them distributed version control systems. The early one that I used was written in Perl, and it was called Aegis, Aegis.
Okay,
I think that would be the first one. It's written by the same guy who made made Cook, the Perl build tool.
Okay, so I knew Simon Cousins when we both worked at Oxford University, and he was the guy behind the Maypole web framework for Perl, amongst many other things. And I'm pretty sure he was using Aegis as well.
Yeah, it was quite popular in the Perl community especially, but basically at that time I was starting to travel for work and carry a laptop, and I just wanted to be able to, well, they call it micro commits now, but that's how I work, how I've always worked with version control, and I wanted to be able to do it when I was disconnected. And then by the time I ended up on projects that used Subversion, I was using a Perl wrapper for Subversion called SVK, which was like a distributed version control system built on top of Subversion and Perl, and you would just commit locally and then push your commits, and it would rewrite them into a linear history on the Subversion server, which was really neat. And I avoided Git for the longest time, and Git related things, until way past when it was fashionable to do that. In fact, the first versions of RSpec were in monotone, and monotone is now no longer developed as far as I know. And the reason it's no longer developed is because Git exists, and a bit of trivial history, I guess, but I find it amusing. Git only exists because when Linus was looking to move off of BitKeeper, he evaluated all of the available distributed tools, evaluated monotone, and said, this is too slow, but he didn't say it in public. He said it to himself and then wrote Git and published it. And after having written Git, he wrote, monotone is the best. I love it. It's the best thing I love. It's the best of all the tools, but I can't use it because it was too slow. Here's a very fast thing that works kind of like what monotone does. And the monotone people looked at the first version of Git and said, oh, those are some interesting optimizations, and made monotone as fast as Git.
Nice.
But at that point, Git had already won because it got the Linux kernel.
Yeah, of course.
But monotone basically lost. I mean, you still hear about Mercurial, but you don't hear about monotone anymore. And the only reason is because Linus didn't say anything in public. He just wrote Git.
Yeah, sure.
So, and I didn't really interact with a lot of the code hosting tools aside from SourceForge. Excuse me, until Bitbucket, and I only use Bitbucket because they provided Mercurial hosting, and I went from monotone to Mercurial, hoping that Mercurial would win. And then everyone ended up on GitHub, and it was a few years after GitHub existed before anything like GitLab or anything like that came along. So like there was, I mean, GitWeb existed ages ago, didn't it? Like, basically it rewrites your Apache config to point it at your Git repository, and then starts your Apache server or something. It's something incredibly hacky like that. But that was how you got like Git onto a sort of Forge style website. Yeah, and there were a few other things. I think Road Code was the one. Cgit, yeah, maybe that's it. There was Road Code, which became Calathea, right? Which is, I think, supports Mercurial and Git. And then there were a bunch of self-hosted options. My experience with these kinds of things, I'm just actually having really good memories now, was track. There was a
Right,
period
yeah.
of time between SourceForge sucking and GitHub existing where everyone just hosted their own track instance, and
I
track is
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah, and I was going to mention track because when I first went indie, which must have been 2009 when I quit my job at Sophos, I spun up a track on some shared hosting server and
Mhm.
used Mercurial with track. I think might have been Subversion,
Mhm.
but like that was where my project was. That was where my website source was on this track thing, and track was like somewhere between Bitbucket and all of Atlassian because it had like the wiki and it had some basic project management and like
Yep.
scheduling and things alongside the code hosting and
Mhm.
issue tracking and whatnot.
And then there's also Redmine, which a lot of people
Yeah.
move from track to Redmine. Redmine is basically, and I'm not saying this in a negative way,
Mm.
Redmine is basically a track clone written in Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
And so the teams using Ruby on Rails that were using track often migrated to
Sure.
Redmine because it was written in the language they were using, so they could customize it.
And
Um,
Rails is an important part of this. Of this whole story because like what we talked about is this like massive ecosystem of different like forges, some of which are shared like sort of hosting provider hosted, what we would now call software rental or software as a service. Some of them are
mhm.
like host your own. Some of them were hybrid, um, and most of them were like free software.
Yep.
And into this came GitHub, and like with Git, which Git. I mean, neither of us is going to say that Git is the best of the distributed version control systems or the easiest to use, or like on
No,
any.
I would actually say the opposite. I would say
Mm,
that it's the worst, and it follows the worse is better thing. We have Git
mm,
now because for the same reasons we have JavaScript, for the same reasons we have C.
mm.
Um, yeah, it's the worst, but it has the best survival characteristics.
Right, and like from the overarching story, that is not in itself particularly important because like whether
Mhm.
people move their version control system to Git or not doesn't or shouldn't necessarily impact their choice of hosting provider. But in fact, everyone moved to GitHub and then
Yep.
had to learn Git because that was how you interacted with a project on GitHub. And
Yep.
that was mostly network effect. And like nowadays, the network effect on GitHub is basically the JavaScript and TypeScript community. Like
Yep.
if you want to post a package to npm, the easiest way to do it is to tag a release on GitHub, and then npm will pick it up. Microsoft own both GitHub and npm and TypeScript. In fact, Microsoft basically now owns the JavaScript ecosystem,
Right.
and that is all well integrated. But back in the day, it was Rails, and I think like technologically, I have a lot of respect for Rails. Obviously, like everybody has mixed opinions on some of the some of the people
Mhm.
who either are or have been key movers in the in the Rails community, um, and where am I going with this? Oh yeah, but the Rails community was, I think, one of the first sort of like leeching communities at scale in the open source world. Like it was one of the first places where what you were expected to do was take all this software that was written and contributed to the community, and then build your for-profit products and not necessarily give anything back. And like the two big sort of and these aren't red flags at all. You are entitled to do this within like the terms of the licenses of all of these things, and it's not necessarily even necessarily against the spirit of free software. It certainly is against the goal of counter to the goal of software freedom. But the two things are: one, every Rails programmer had a Mac running TextMate, which at the time was a proprietary software product,
Mhm.
and they all use GitHub.
Yep. Yeah, and I was very active in that community. I do want to catch up with chat
Of
just
course.
for 1 second, and then we'll get back onto it. Adobo Sosa asks the easiest way to get started with Objective C in 2021. Resources are scarce to say the least.
Yep.
I'm going to give a quick answer and say watch this stream, and we
Please like
will.
and subscribe.
And we will. I think we should. That is probably a good next topic of discussion,
Yeah,
actually, and
absolutely.
so we'll put that on the back burner for a moment while we continue talking about version control and free software. That's great. Welcome to the stream. Yeah, so I was very active in the Rails community. I mean, from basically the beginning. I often joke, although I don't think it's a joke. I'm fairly certain it's true because the community was small enough at the time that I was the first person in Canada to launch a Rails application.
Right.
And because my first Rails was released to the world in August of 2004, and my first application went live in October. Um,
Okay.
and I have a lot of respect for the things that Rails made normal and new. Convention over. I always say if we only learn one thing from Ruby on Rails. Um, as an industry, it's convention over configuration.
Okay.
That's the thing that I want everyone to learn, because it was beautiful. I don't use Rails much anymore. I've actually started using PHP a lot more, but that's besides the point. In the Rails community, there was a core group of about 20 people, and I think this is pretty much public knowledge now. We had a group, it was a password protected IRC channel, and there were only like 15 or 20 of us in it when it started, called Caboose, which was sort of the early adopters of the Rails community, sort of congregated there. And the people who started GitHub, and also the people who started PowerSet that got acquired by Microsoft and became Bing, were sort of in this early Rails community called Caboose. And so GitHub was something that I had early knowledge of and access to, but I just didn't. I didn't see the appeal at the time, because I was comfortable in the ways that I was working, and I didn't really see how pull requests were any better than what I was doing already. My opinions have changed slightly, but not as much as you might think. And so GitHub sort of came around, and if we like, I like to focus on what's the thing, or what's the one thing that we learned from these changes in technology. I think that the thing that we can learn from GitHub is the pull request model. For better or for worse, it has succeeded, and people like it.
Yeah. So
and that's something that none of these other tools we've talked about have, really.
I don't know what you mean.
and I think that is not what I'm going to take that off. I think that isn't what the GitHub people expected to sort of survive from GitHub. That they, the sort of discussion at the time was about the fact that everyone could have their own personal fork of their software, right? And that there wouldn't be because like forks used to be these massive political bum fights that were like last resort. It was like going on strike if you're a union. You only do it when all other forms of negotiation have failed. So things like the 3 or 4 or 5 different BSD flavors that exist, or GCC becoming EGCS and then becoming GCC again. Like these were massive deals in their communities.
Yeah, and fork used to be a bad word,
right,
in the community. Yeah,
and now you create a fork when you want to write your own patch and you don't have write access to the upstream repository. But their view was that that GitHub would become the home of the bazaar model, and everyone would have their version, which worked really well for them, of whatever software. Let's pick FetchMail because that's CSR's project, and he talks about the bazaar model a lot. So I've got a fetch mail that works really well with my email workflow and my tools, and you've got one that works really well for integrating with Usenet because you like using Usenet. And then I go, oh yeah, I could do with some Usenet. So I take patches from your fork into my fork, and they don't have to go through like github.com/esr/fetchmail or github.com/fetchmail-team/fetchmail, because we can do it out of band in these, sort of in this distributed but centralized set of repositories. And as Matthew Scala points out, that's not what happened, and indeed in some cases it's because the thing is so complex that you wouldn't want to like try and build it yourself, and maintain your fork. But also it's just not how people work. Like we're all using Facebook's version of React, and the Node's version of Node, and the GNU project's version of GNU Step, and we're not kind of maintaining our own parallel versions of all of the software that we use.
In some communities, there is for a short period of time you should use this person's fork of this thing because it adds this feature or whatever. But what became sort of, I think, common usage or common expectation is that you would open a pull request and that you would expect it to get merged into upstream. And there's been a lot of digital ink spilled over the sort of the rights and responsibilities of people who create open source and things like that. I personally do not. If I'm looking for a plugin that does something, for instance, in a Rails app, I'm looking for what is the official source of this plugin, and I'm not using some one-off sort of this fork but with this feature that I need added, because I trust the sort of the canonical repository's version of it more than I trust some rando's fork. And
if everyone does that, then that means that that you end up with this centralized model where the canonical version is still the canonical version. That's just, it's entirely natural, but it's not the world that they were trying to build.
Yeah, and that's it. I don't know what I have a slightly less good faith view on why GitHub was built. I think GitHub was built to make a few people rich, but I think if they had an opinion about this, it was definitely, we want to support sort of the bazaar model of free software development, and what we ended up with is everything is centralized around GitHub.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's move on to the reason I sort of brought up this history was to discuss the paper cuts, and you mentioned the fact that it is a for-profit company whose job was to make the founders rich. That's not a problem in the free software world. You are free to use software for any purpose.
Absolutely.
But what they did was take the Git free software project, pay Software Freedom Conservancy a fixed fee to use the Git trademark in their in their name, because at the time Git was a conservancy project. I think it is now a Linux Foundation project, and
I think so as well.
And then built a proprietary product using the trademark, and then effectively enclosed the entire of the open source community,
and also used Ruby on Rails to build it,
right,
which is MIT licensed, so it's sort of kind of expected, I guess. But they used Ruby on Rails and Git, and put those together and made GitHub. And I had a couple of early interactions with the founders of GitHub where I suggested things like, I said, hey, it looks like what you're doing is interesting. I'm interested in adding Mercurial support. I'll even sign an NDA and do the work for free. And they said, no, why would we ever want Mercurial support in GitHub?
Right. Right.
And at the time, I could think of many reasons, and I still, all of those reasons are still valid, except that
Mm.
nobody uses Mercurial anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and and uh, there, and so there was the whole thing was built on free software, and still is. One of the things that it's going to come out at a certain point in this discussion, and so I might as well out it now. I think I have the same opinion of GitHub as I do of O'Reilly.
Hmm.
That O'Reilly just takes from the open source community and gives nothing back. And I think that this is especially true of GitHub, and more so now, which I guess is a segue into the latest paper cut, that they take from the open source community and the free software community, and they give nothing back. And when I make that argument to people who are very, very invested, emotionally invested in a for-profit company for some reason that I don't understand, they always argue, well, GitHub made Atom, the Atom editor, and they gave that away. Okay, fine. I mean, Atom as a text editor that people used was a flash in the pan, and you've given me one example of something that GitHub has given back when they've taken so much, and that
Yeah.
I find
Yeah.
very distasteful.
Yeah. And I think that like there's this sort of marketing position that is promoted that like GitHub heart emoji open source, and it's
Right? Yeah, of course they love it.
well it's cupboard love, right? They love it because it keeps them alive, not because of any emotional attachment to it. It's like the same. My cat doesn't love me. My cat loves my hand because my hand can open the cupboard and get the food out of the cupboard and put the food in the bowl.
Right.
That like the love that my cat has for me is the same as the love that GitHub has for open source. That's how it gets fed.
Right. And actually, I don't know how if I'm jumping ahead too far or not,
No, go
but
for
the
it.
latest the latest paper cut is sort of the extreme extension
Yeah,
of
yeah.
taking it and not giving back.
Hmm. No, indeed. Was there an intermediate paper cut that I wanted to mention? Um, there may well have been, but it's gone out of my mind. So let's talk Copilot. So Copilot, like as technology, it's vaguely interesting. In fact, sorry, let's. It's fairly interesting as technology. Um, they've trained what they call an AI. I'm going to call it a statistical inference model because it's fundamentally maths. Just because like the difference between AI and software is one is maths that the programmer doesn't understand, and one of them is maths that the programmer does understand. But that doesn't fundamentally change the nature of of the system. And Copilot is an AI statistical inference system, whichever you want to call it, that has been trained on what a lot of software looks like and can thus predict what your software should look like. Um, it so their stated use case is that when you have a lot of boilerplate, you can get you can get this tool Copilot to like type out that boilerplate for you. Now, some people don't like that because if you have a lot of boilerplate, you should probably build a DSL or a library or sort of change your level of abstraction. And we can definitely talk about the we like the application Copilot itself. But what is more concerning to me as a an advocate of free software is the fact that they seem to have trained it on the collection of software that they could find on GitHub, regardless of the license of that software, regardless of the the sort of intent for that software being published, and have built a tool that basically just regurgitates combinations of the ideas it seems in that software. Now, some people say, we were talking about this in the pre-show, that some people say that like what is different between Copilot and regular programming is whether a computer is doing the creation or not. But I don't think a computer is doing any creation here. It's running an algorithm on a bunch of source text to create some other source text. Like, if you want to talk about that being creative, then you have the fallacy of the bid. Is the uppercase algorithm creative? We would probably say no. Well, what about the ROT13 algorithm? Is that creative? We would probably say no. At what point does I turn this handle on this sausage machine and the raw meat turns into a sausage? Like, at what point does that become a creative act?
Right, and I think that's the interesting distinction. Is I wanted to, before I forget this thought, wasn't there a case where somebody started with an empty file and it filled in the GPL text?
That's one of the things they say in their sort of marketing post for Copilot, or rather their sort of defense of it being a creative tool and not just a parrot of existing code, is that there's over 700,000 instances of the GPL in the training set, and therefore, given an empty file, it will often just type out the GPL.
That's hilarious to me.
There's also a case where, like, someone, a user of this tool, typed out a comment saying fast inverse square root, and Copilot copied out verbatim, including the comments, the GPL implementation of the fast inverse square root from the Quake engine. And then when they typed a comment that said copyright text goes here or something like that, it started typing out the MIT license. So this tool put, and there's no, oh no it didn't, it synthesized something else. No, it copied verbatim some GPL code into a file, and then not only didn't attribute it, but copied a different license with attribution to a different author into the same file. This is incredibly dangerous for everybody. Hi, Amiga Gamer 1200. It is dangerous for the free software users. It is dangerous for proprietary software users, and for the same reason. This thing is a machine that just smooshes together all software that has been found on GitHub and turns it into fuel for Microsoft's product, which they say they're going to be charging for further down the line.
And I realize, and we've talked about this at length, and people have written about it, and people more knowledgeable about it. You quoted me on Twitter. A thing that I often say is that the problem with software licenses is that lawyers don't often understand software, and software people don't understand legalese or laws. And interestingly, some of my work has me being the software person that tries to understand the laws better, and working with lawyers to help them understand software better. So I'm trying to make the world, I'm trying to make that situation better in where I can. But I can tell you that if Copilot, if I find a chunk of code that I have released under a copyleft license in somebody else's repo, I'm not going to accept Copilot typed this for me as a defense of somebody infringing my copyright. Just because, we have established rules, and I can't remember specifically what they are, but there are established rules for when you paste code snippets onto Stack Overflow. I believe they are CC0, but I could be wrong about that.
They're not CC0, they are CC BY.
Oh, okay.
So you have to attribute code that you paste from Stack Overflow.
Right, okay.
And in fact, they relicensed it at one point, because they relicensed from I from like CC by 3 to CC by 3.5, or from 3.5 to 4, and that caused a bit of a
Okay.
stink because that means they unilaterally relicensed all of these contributions, which they claim are still owned by the original contributors.
Aha. So I have looked into this in detail at some point. But when I if and it's infrequent for me, but when I paste code in from Stack Overflow, I put the link in a comment because I want to be able to find it again.
Yeah.
And the the thing for me is there are a whole bunch of this is, I think we both agree that this is definitely sort of gray area, murky territory for copyright.
Mm.
Um, and but I give zero fucks about how gray area and murky it is when somebody is using my code that I wrote, in a way other than what the license allows. I'm going to have a personal problem with that, and I'm not going to take it up with Microsoft for various reasons. But I don't think it's Microsoft's fault. I think Microsoft is doing nasty, nasty shit in this case. But people using Copilot are not aware of what they might be doing, and I think that that's massively problematic.
So it's actually just going back to the topic of
Matthew
the.
Scala says it's what color are your bits all over again. GitHub and Copilot, the Copilot user, are each claiming the copyright status no longer exists after it has gone through a matrix multiply.
Absolutely. I
And
mean,
that's
at what point that if we don't think that Rot 13 is, um, is a creative act, then why do we think that a matrix multiply is a creative act or a Markov chain?
right. Mm-hmm.
So Stack Overflow's rules, actually, I was wrong. Say you provide to the public network. Any content you provide to the public network is perpetually and irrevocably licensed to Stack Overflow, not actually to anybody else, which is interesting. It means that readers aren't allowed to, except for the following bit. On a worldwide royalty-free, non-exclusive basis, pursuant to Creative Commons licensing terms CC by SA 4. So actually, code that you paste out of Stack Overflow is under a share-alike license.
That's copyleft.
Yeah, well, it means that if you paste it into your project, then you have to share at least that bit that you pasted.
Right. How many people actually do this?
I don't do that because I thought it was CC by. So I was just providing attribution. So yeah, I
My
mean,
usage of Stack Overflow is typically not. I paste error messages into Stack Overflow and then understand what the problem was, and then I fix it myself. I very rarely paste code from Stack Overflow because, well, it just doesn't match what I need. Code from somebody else's project doesn't match what I need. I use Stack Overflow when I use it, and I'm an infrequent user of it compared to many people. When I use it, it is to help me understand the problem I'm having better because I would like to understand the problem. But that's very interesting.
yeah. So like the there are various problems with combining all of these things from all these different licenses. Not least that all of these licenses have obligations, and if you share code under these licenses, then you are expected to abide by these obligations. Like even if we just consider the MIT license, which does allow sort of integration into commercial software, it still requires attribution, and this Copilot tool is not telling you where the source code comes from because it probably doesn't know. But by the time it's done the matrix multiplication, it can't draw a line between the source text that it used. What was the signal in the training set that gave me the corresponding signal in the output labeling. That information is lost, and so you cannot you cannot conform to the MIT license if you use such software. You certainly can't conform to the GPL because you have to they require that the code is shared under the same terms, and Microsoft isn't in a position to do that because Microsoft isn't the user of the software. Like, the user of the software is, and they are not being told that this thing came from a GPL source, so they're not in a position to do it either. So really, this is literally the enclosure of a creative and intellectual commons by a $1 trillion capitalist enterprise. And once again, I have no problem with $1 trillion capitalist companies using free software. Like, it's literally freedom zero. It's a freedom to use the software for any purpose. If you want to, make a load of 14-year-old Chinese people commit suicide building electronic devices using free software, then that's within the terms of the license, whether I like it or not. But I'm in no position to stop you doing that. However, if what you want to do is to ignore the terms of the license and do that anyway, and then not participate in the grooming of the commons, then you're destroying that community that's spent decades sort of fighting to exist against against these forces.
Yeah, and I mean, I obviously also appreciate Freedom Zero and have no problem if people want to use those things, but I have a problem with this idea, this hand waviness around AI and ML and all this bullshit that they can't prove where it came from, because we can prove where it came from with fucking Elasticsearch.
And they
one of the projects. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and they can know where it came from by only only drawing into their training data set code that they're allowed to use in such a way. Like, there would be no problem if they said, here is the MIT Copilot. It's been trained on a bunch of MIT licensed software or MIT compatible software, and therefore anything that is generated by this will automatically have the MIT license attached to it and the attribution to its authors. Then no problem. If they said, here is the AGPL3 Copilot that has only been trained on AGPL3 incompatible software, and therefore anything that gets created will have the copying file from the AGPL3, again, no problem. But if you combine those things with proprietary software, by the way, someone else has found, I can't remember which service it was, like Alert Logic or something. If you type alert logic token equals and then get it to autocomplete, it will autocomplete valid tokens from other people's accounts.
Right. So an interesting thought that I just had, the Windows NT source code has been leaked and hosted on GitHub at various points.
Yeah. So you think it's probably in the training data for
Yeah, at what point does Microsoft start caring about this? And Microsoft starts caring about this when their own code is being used against them by their own tool. I mean, I just uncovered the plot for a fantastic dystopian science fiction novel. The Copilot equivalent in this story is trained on all of the code in there, including the creators of Copilot's own code.
Well, that's basically how the master control program from Tron was created.
Right. I've been thinking about this. I started watching Star Trek: The Next Generation with my wife. And because I love TNG. TNG was the best Star Wars. And there's an episode early in second season where Geordi LaForge and Data go into the holodeck, and Geordi says, "Computer, generate a program that is capable of defeating Data." And the computer program basically just takes over the entire, becomes self-aware and takes over the entire enterprise. That is the level of thing that I'm thinking of with Copilot. On one hand, I would love to see a lot of this stuff sort of indexed and reused, but on the other hand, one of the core tenets, one of the core reasons why we have copyleft in the first place is copyleft is using copyright, is a hack to use copyright against itself, basically. And now we're using software that reads copyleft software to use copyleft against itself effectively. One of the things that I work on periodically because of my open source license compliance work is indexing various. I have a small tool that indexes various GitHub repositories because I'm looking for. I call it like snippet search.
Right.
I want to take this chunk of code, find me all of the open source repositories on GitHub where this chunk of code exists, so that I can see if I've got a license compliance violation.
Yeah.
And if I can do that with a bit of Ruby and Python, why can't Microsoft do it? And this is sort of, a rhetorical question. What if I can do it with a bit of Ruby and Python? Why can't Microsoft do it? And I know they can, but the problem is that they're claiming they can't. And this is the shit that I hate about the AI and ML communities, is that they say, oh yeah, we just build this machine and then we feed data into the machine, and then what comes out the other side, we don't know where it came from. And that pisses me off to no end, because people are driving cars with this shit in it. And I think that if it's true that when you train a machine learning algorithm or an AI with data, and you can't work backwards and you can't, you're gonna love this phrase. If the AI or machine learning algorithm can't work backwards and reason about how it got to its answer, then it's insufficient. Because if we can't have that, we need to be able to work backwards from what input did you use to make this decision, and where did this come from?
Yeah, and
that's how humans work. Hopefully.
I mean, that is how humans work. In that, they'll make a decision and then try and justify it later.
Right.
But those algorithms do exist. It's called explainable AI. They tend to be less accurate. We're talking they are sort of 90% accurate, and the sort of unexplainable deep learning or recurrent neural network models are 98% accurate. And so that's why they don't get used, is because people would prefer accurate but inexplicable results over explainable but inaccurate results. So that tells you something about the politics of the people who are doing this. They want efficiency, they want automation, they want no humans involved. They don't want let's make this one person 10 times more productive, but they still have to understand and sign off on all of the decisions. They want, let's get rid of these 20 people completely by replacing them with with this machine.
Absolutely, and that shit just really pisses me off. I don't. If you're replacing something, if you're replacing a thing, it has to be, I think, better in all ways. Amusingly, because I'm a Canadian who lives in Sweden, I've experienced a lot of sort of cultural shifts and cultural changes. In Sweden, and especially during COVID times, it's become very, very normal. Self-checkout has become very normalized. One of the ways that restaurants have stayed afloat in Sweden, aside from the government actually not preventing them from staying afloat, or not limiting the number of people who can be in a place and so on, one of the ways they've stayed sort of competitive, I guess, is that if you go to most restaurants in Sweden now, you open up your phone and you make your order and say, I'm sitting at this table.
Mm.
So you have fewer in-person interactions. And conversely, when I interact with some of my Canadian friends, although mostly people that I'm related to who are not friends, they're all up in arms about self checkouts. My grandmother would never use a self checkout machine at the grocery store because she felt like she was creating jobs. She was creating job loss
Mm.
by using self checkout. But in Sweden, we said, hey, self checkout can be better for everyone, and also, we have unions and shit. So this is better for everyone if you use self checkout, and nobody really questions it here. And that is, I'm totally okay with, let's replace humans with automation where possible, but also let's be aware of what we're missing out on when we replace humans with automation.
Yeah, and
Um,
if what we're missing out on is people who type boilerplate JavaScript into React apps, then actually, we can afford to lose that, and the
Absolutely.
software engineering industry can afford to to lose a lot of boilerplate JavaScript being typed out. What our Commons movement can't afford to lose out on is the boundary around its commons. They can't afford to lose out on the difference between free software and Microsoft products. Like that has for a long time been one of the key battlegrounds of the free software movement. Is what Microsoft through Bill Gates has wanted, the software industry to look like, and what people in the free software community have wanted people to look like. Anyway, we've kind of ignored the chat for a while, so I'm going to take it in a vague order. Amiga Game 1200 said, and this is all Amiga Game 1200 for the moment, that the problem we're having is that we're now saying, okay, so we know that GNU-Step is hosted on GitHub, right? And so that means that GNU-Step is part of the training set for this tool that is shitting out code into other people's proprietary repositories. And so, if someone tries to type out some Objective-C with Copilot, there is a chance, there probably isn't a whole lot of Objective-C software on GitHub at the moment, so there's a significant chance that parts of GNU-Step would be copied into that repository, and that therefore, that we're missing out on some LGPL or GPL code. Now, who is going to do the compliance check and the enforcement? Who is going to do that lawsuit? It's going to be a charity. It's going to be someone like the Software Freedom Conservancy or the Software Freedom Law Centre, who can't afford to fight Microsoft. And so Microsoft is going to win just because they are on the side of the capitalist class and we are not.
Yeah, this is an unfortunate thing. And actually, to bring it back around to Sweden, one of the things that I learned because I asked about it, it's well known in Canada at least, and in the U.S. that the person with the most money to pay their lawyers wins. In basically any situation. For example, Bill Cosby just got released from prison. In Sweden, they have a really interesting thing. So in Canada, we have this idea in criminal law where you can have, and comedians joke about this all the time. If you can't afford a lawyer, then we're going to provide the shittiest, lowest paid lawyer we can find for you for free. And that's not really true, but comedians make that joke, and there is some truth in it. In Sweden, amusingly, apparently in criminal cases, because I looked into how public defense works in Sweden because I was interested in the idea. If you have cause to retain a criminal defense lawyer in Sweden, the cost that is paid to the lawyer is actually a fixed cost, and it's the same price as if you were paying out of your own pocket. And so this is actually a good model. Lawyers bill the public the same amount that they bill the private, and the public just doesn't pay the bill individually. And so, but because we're dealing with a large American company, Microsoft has enough money to just have their lawyers bury you in paperwork.
Yeah.
And individuals don't have that. So if these fights are going to be, fought, they definitely have to be not fought in an American court. And that is hugely problematic, but it also explains a lot about a lot of the problems with life. That these companies can just sort of do whatever they want, and because they have the legal capacity to be able to defend themselves against it. Or not defend themselves, but at least they can spend more money to make sure that you can't afford to defend yourself. Yep. And that is hugely problematic. On your point about GNU Step, I would wager, without having done exactly this measurement, but I have done similar measurements on GitHub, I would wager that GNU Step is the single largest repository of Objective-C code on GitHub. And so I think your assertion that there is a significant chance that Objective-C code written by Copilot, it comes from GNU Step. I don't think it's a significant chance. I think that if you're using Copilot and you have an Objective-C project, I would say it is an absolute certainty that you are going to be getting some GNU Step code in there. The exception would be MIT licensed old, because everyone has moved to Swift now. I would say the exception would be old MIT licensed, like CocoaPods things for iOS stuff.
Yeah. But then those are MIT licensed, and again, that has particular obligations that aren't going to be fulfilled.
Absolutely. And so I think that this is it is a legal gray area, so we can't say that this is, illegal, but it is a highly questionable business activity. On one hand, in the Trailer Park Boys, this is called an atotoso. I told you so. We all hated Microsoft in the free software community for a long time. And I talked on this stream before about how when Mono came out and Microsoft issued their sort of "we won't enforce patents against Mono" or whatever agreement, people in the free software community still said that is not good enough. And they were met with a lot of aggression over this sort of stance that you should still not use Mono for your stuff. And it turns out that Microsoft sort of kept that promise, but it was, possibly because they had bigger fish to fry on the fucking over free software plan, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and so the other thing is, we were talking. Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to make a sort of a personal statement that, if you had told 1998 Stephen that in 2019 Microsoft would be the largest contributor to open source and free software, I would not have believed it. And now I totally believe it, and I understand why.
Yeah.
This is the extend, or what is it? The 3 E's.
Embrace, extend, extinguish.
Yeah, embrace, extend, extinguish. Right. That's what this is. That is what Copilot is.
Yeah.
It's 1998 Microsoft up to their old tricks.
So the other thing Amiga Gamer 1200 brought up, which I'm going to skip the thing about Deanna Troi being useless, because I feel pain, so much pain. But 3 statements that basically sum up the David Graeber's book Bullshit Jobs in 3 messages, and talk about Keynes, John Maynard Keynes' idea of technological unemployment,
Mhm.
and the fact that actually like productivity has gone down, wages have gone down, working hours have gone up in the time
Mhm.
since. Well, certainly since the 70s, possibly before that, but like definitely the 70s. Now, Keynes was wrong. Like Keynes, what Keynes was saying was that like if we automate all of the work that we currently have to do, then we'll get the working week down from 40 hours to 2 hours. Um, and that is true. I would argue that the amount of time that is spent on agriculture now is definitely a minuscule fraction of the amount of time that was spent on agriculture in 1930. But there are other things to do, and some of those are new jobs that have been enabled by technological development, and some of those are bullshit jobs. Um, so like and in even in some sort of weird like socialist utopia, you would have less work to do, but there's still what is called necessary work, right? There's this idea in Marxism, or sorry, there's this idea that Karl Marx came up with. It's not in Marxism; it's in Capital, in Volume One of Capital, that um, that like some of the time you spend doing your job, it goes into work that like reproduces the your own living conditions, that pays for your food, your lodging, your family, and your security and so on. And the rest of it is what he calls surplus, what some people call profit, and goes to the owner of the capital, i.e., of the machines and the office or factory where you work, and the person who provided the raw ingredients that go into the product that you're making with your work. And that is exploitation, because that's work you're doing beyond what you need to do, that is going into making somebody else money. It's surplus and it's exploitative. Now, that so the idea is that this this amount of work, the necessary work, has shrunk over time, and so in a socialist utopia, we would be we would be spending less time if we distributed evenly all the work that goes into making sure that everyone has a house and some food and security and everything. We would all spend much less time working, but we still might spend a bunch of time fucking about with computers, or or any of these other what are bullshit jobs. The only difference is we do it because we want to do it, not because it's it's a sort of necessary condition to to survive in society. The bit that is the necessary condition would be taking out the trash, cleaning the toilets, growing carrots, those kinds of things. And that if all like 70 million of us in the UK, or if all like however 12 people there are in Sweden, if they all like shared this between them, then they would have a lot less work to do. Or you could like find people who really fucking love cleaning toilets and growing carrots, and say, "Great, how about you do it all the time, and just share the carrots among everybody else." And then everybody's happy, because the people who love carrots get to grow carrots all their lives, and the people who love eating carrots get to eat carrots all their lives, and nobody is working at that point. But the the idea that there wouldn't then be other things that we can do, that we wouldn't want experimental particle physicists or software engineers, or like someone to make sure that nobody breaks into the department for health, head office, or someone to clean the floor in a hospital. That's not going to shrink to zero. It cannot. It cannot shrink to zero, because some of that is service work. Service work is defined by its inelasticity. And that's why I hate the phrase software as a service, because it isn't inelastic. Like the software was all written already. It's been done. We don't need to put more effort into it. So we shouldn't still be paying for it. The having a haircut is a service. You cannot, unless you shrink the population or put something in the food that makes everybody bald, you cannot shrink the amount of time that is spent on haircuts, or
I
make
have
it
successfully shrunk the amount of time that is spent on
right, yeah,
haircuts.
or you decide that like everybody has full hair and a beard. But even then, people still need haircuts because they get their hair matted, they get it caught in machinery. They suffer from like hair loss diseases and need it restyling, whatever. But given like that doesn't happen, all right, let's go with healthcare then. The nursing is an inelastic job. Like the people who need looking after need looking after. It takes a certain amount of time. Like infirm people who can't bathe themselves, you can't make a machine that does that and still and still kind of give everybody their dignity. So someone is going to do that. That is going to take a fixed amount of time. No amount of technology, no amount of like Keynesian technological unemployment is going to reduce the amount of time that nurses spend bathing people.
Right, and this is why I'm pro, automating the things that can be automated. One of the stories that I tell people when I live in Sweden. So we do a lot of driving between our two houses, soon to be one house. Thank fuck. And you can drive all of the gas stations in Sweden. The pumps, the pumps. It's self-service. There's no such thing as somebody pumps your gas for you in Sweden. And the gas pumps never close. It is impossible to drive across Canada in every one of the 24 hours in a day because there are distances between gas stations that are open in the 24 hours that are longer than the range of any known vehicle. And we encountered this because we used to drive across Canada, and now we just drive across Sweden. And there's no reason for it except that they turn the gas pumps off when they go home in Canada.
Right.
And in Sweden, they don't do that. They close the shop sometimes, so you can't go and buy snacks when you fuel up your car. But you can always fuel up your car because we don't need people to fuel up our car for us. That's not a thing that we need. There are some states in the U.S. where pumping your own gas is illegal. Oregon is one, or was one when I was frequenting there. And so it is, I'm sure, possible in parts of Oregon to not be able to get fuel to get across Oregon at certain times of the day. And when you're driving across Canada, especially through the prairies, I had a truck that had about 1,000 kilometers of range and found that it was 1,200 kilometers between two gas stations that are open that serve diesel at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I found that on multiple occasions. And that just doesn't exist in Sweden. Amusingly, when people complain about self-checkouts on Facebook in my sort of family groups on Facebook, they say, we're taking away jobs, we're losing jobs, and so on. And I always say, hey, maybe we should make the self-checkout machines pay taxes. And people say, but taxes are bad. And that is a really weird thing. On your comments about sort of socialist utopia, we have a farm up north, and I'm going to grow way more fucking potatoes than I can eat myself, and I have no interest in selling potatoes because potatoes are not that expensive. And so I am going to be that farmer that just farms potatoes and gives away potatoes to anyone who wants them, because I want to farm potatoes, and I cannot eat all of the potatoes that it makes sense to farm. You can grow 50 kilos of potatoes in a box.
Yeah.
Like on a pallet, in a box made from a pallet. You can grow 50 kilos of potatoes in one of those. I like potatoes, and I can't eat 50 kilos of potatoes in a period of time before they go bad. So, but I had to work, way too much in sort of, the capitalist society in order to be able to afford to have this situation where I'm going to farm potatoes and give them away. If we had something like universal basic income or so on, I wouldn't be doing 2 streams a week about Amiga and Objective-C development. I would be doing 5 streams a week about those and various other topics. I can't afford to do that as my full-time job now.
Please like and subscribe.
Please like and subscribe. Patreon.com/srbaker or I am Lee G.
Yes.
I am Lee G. And if I could afford to just share knowledge about software type things full time, I would totally fucking do that. And I well, thanks to the upcoming move, I will be able to afford to do that soon. But there are these things at play that, you know, the Copilot is sort of a natural. Copilot is a political hot potato in the software community right now for many reasons, but also because high-paid programmers are worried that it's going to put them out of work. Well, guess what? Low-paid service people have been being put out of work by exactly this kind of shit for many years.
Yeah, yeah.
And we are now just experiencing the thought of the possibility of it happening, and people are losing their minds over it, and it really, really bothers me. There are many people in the world who would do nursing in their spare time. My wife is one of those people who just really enjoys, through, you know, a poor experience when her grandmother was sick. My wife's grandmother, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this. My wife's grandmother had bone cancer and required a lot of care. And my wife decided that she wanted to provide care for people. And she did so for free for a period of time. And there are people who will do that. There are people who will do those kinds of activities that you can't outsource to a machine. And but now we are experiencing this in the software community, which has been privileged for way too fucking long. And so maybe this is one of the good things about Copilot. If there is a good thing about Copilot, is that finally software developers are realizing that maybe you can be replaced too.
Yeah, and like, so, you know, on the narrow part of the argument is the legal part, and I think this is just as bad for writers of proprietary software as it is for for writers of free software, because, as Amiga Gamer 1200 pointed out, we're all not going to sue Microsoft, so we're going to go after the people who use the tool in the same way the SCO went after the people who used Linux, not after, like, I mean, there is no sort of mythical like Linux corporation, but they sued IBM, but they shook down all of IBM's customers, and that's where they got their money from, because those people were using SCO's code, allegedly.
Yep.
They are on the hook. If you use Copilot, you are on the hook for, you know, someone, and it might be Facebook, it might be one of these big corporations who goes, hold on, we wrote React, and we have put specific terms on how React gets reused, and now we see that you have typed it out into your project, and you are not sharing it according to those terms. We're going to go after you. So, you know, I'd be very worried as a Microsoft customer, as a user of any of the things that GitHub provides, that there is a chance that there is software that I'm not allowed to use that is going into my products that I'm now selling to people and warranting as my own. So it's not just bad for the free software movement, but on that, and then there's that sort of bigger moral picture about, you know, the fact that we have this sort of commons and it is being eroded by this, you know, very large company. That is, you know, that is unfortunately the cost of, like, you know, of existing in this society, is that the people with the most money win. You've already covered that, and then there is the other big picture about, you know, what we have been doing to the rest of the world. When we say software is eating the world, we're now doing to ourselves. Software is now eating the software engineer. You know, like you, I find it hard to feel, you know, too much sympathy for, like, you know, if your job is typing out the kind of software that can be replaced by Copilot, then, like, you know, I don't feel particularly sad for like losing that job. Either you will go into a more creative job in the software industry, or you will find something else to do. Hopefully, of course, society isn't set up to help you or to support you while you do that, because it took you a long time to learn those software engineering skills. It will take you a long time to learn the other skills, and you don't get like a massive amount of severance or unemployment payment. Join a union and fight against those terms. But so I was listening to an audiobook on anti-fascism, on the anti-fascist action movement this afternoon, and they said like one interpretation of what fascism did in the 30s was that fascism was colonialism for white people, and that this is what we're experiencing now. What we have been doing to other people, and seeing as like the natural progression of technology, is now being done to ourselves, and we suddenly realise it's a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This is as I said, if there is one good thing to come out of Copilot, this is it. That suddenly the people in high paying jobs. I have personally mentored people who went through like an 8-week learn to code boot camp and put them in a 6-figure salary job on the arse end of that. And that is those people. As long as software and computers exist, I am not going to be hurting for work. I've already weathered at least 2 recessions, depending on how you count. I would say probably more like half a dozen, for various reasons. Many of them related to the fact that I'm white and come from a rich country. I'm not worried about my employability in this space, except that it might continue to exist. But so I share your sentiment that I don't really feel bad that we might automate some of these jobs. I feel bad that we are automating all jobs and that people are finding it hard to live as a result.
Right. Yeah. If we had a society that supported people whose work was no longer necessary, or like found them something else to do that was a meaningful contribution, then it would be a different situation.
Absolutely.
On which the Swanson Plays asks, and we shall answer this question and then move on to Adobo Souza's questions about Objective C, because this was an Objective C stream
Yes.
a long time ago. But the Swanson Plays asks, is there a better solution or maybe a different approach to deal with copyrighted software? It seems like Copilot just highlights some of the existing issues. Do you want to take that one first?
Well, my feeling on that is that Copilot basically just does that. Copilot is shining a spotlight on all of the issues around traditional copyright applying to software in the way that it does. Copyright was created theoretically to protect creators of things a long time ago, just like the patent system was also created to protect creators in a large way, and those things are being abused. And we see that we have patent trolls that are sort of abusing the patent system. I would say that in the same way that patent trolls are abusing the patent system, Copilot is abusing the copyright system. And so I would completely agree with that. The Copilot is just shining a spotlight on all of the problems around applying copyright to software in the same way that we apply it to other things that it was intended for.
Yeah, and I think that there are 2 different, like, sort of ideal outcomes. One of which the system is set up to develop, and the other one it isn't. But the actual outcome will likely be a third one that the system is also set up to develop and that has better protection. So, like, the first thing is clarifying the copyright law. Now, when I discussed this on Twitter, and this is not an uncommon point of discussion, someone said, "Wouldn't it be great if the if the copyright law gave us a framework for understanding what is or isn't a derived work that could be coded into an algorithm and then we could just understand it? And the answer is no. That would be horrific. That would be bad for the people who are on the sort of freedom side. It would be bad for the people who are on the corporate protection side. It would be bad for everyone because that would be written at some point in time. Like, let's say that Stallman and Evan Moglen came together and went, you know what, there's this problem with copyright. Let's write this GPL. Let's say that derived works are protected in this way, that linking constitutes a derived work, and now let's write the definition of what is linking and what is a derivation or modification, and like encode that. They would have done it in 1985, and linkers have changed, software projects have changed, technology has changed. Copilot didn't exist. They certainly wouldn't have said like training your AI on this is going to count as a derived work or a modification, because that wouldn't have crossed their minds. And so it would be very easy for people to say, well, they didn't write down that we're not allowed to do this, therefore we're allowed to do this. So that would be horrific. Like, that is a non-solution.
This dovetails into my claim that software licenses are no longer sufficient because they were written. Software licenses and free software licenses and open source software licenses were written at a time, at a point in time, as you said, where licensing was the thing that was sort of, the weapon we had. And, it's bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah.
To abuse the phrase.
Yeah, which is why we should get ESR back on our side, because he would bring a gun. Or more guns.
he would claim to bring a gun, but he would not.
Right. It's such a concealed carry you can't even detect it. So one outcome that is the outcome that is plausible is that this gets tested legally. That someone, maybe not the Copilot case, maybe some other case, someone says you have used my work in this machine learning system and I disagree with your permission to use that. And that would get shaken out, maybe in the courts in the US, maybe in the courts in Europe. A conclusion would be reached, and then that would inform that jurisdiction's approach to the way that this copyright situation is resolved, and through the Berne Convention would inform to some extent the way it's resolved in other places, but it could still be done incompatibly in the other places. Copyright law is not harmonised across the world. Just respect for the copyright holders is harmonised across the world. So that is possible, and it is even possible that would happen in our favour, where us is the commons, the intellectual commons movement in general. Very unlikely it would happen in our favour, but it is possible. The other outcome that would be desirable is the complete end of copyright protection. That's basically, like copyleft is using copyright against itself. Well, if there's no way to, for a creator, or maybe it doesn't even need to be a creator. Maybe it's like the end of copyright transfers to agents, to middlemen, to licensing companies, to moral persons in general. If maybe the creator gets to protect their work and nobody else gets to take ownership of that protection from them, i.e., you're not allowed to have record labels anymore. You're not allowed to have like software companies anymore. You're not allowed to have holding companies. You're not allowed to have license trolls and so on. Then there would be no need for copyleft, because all intellectual works would be as free as each other. But that is incredibly unlikely. That would require a revolution. That would require a complete change in the governance and the interests of those who are doing the governance of large parts of society.
I remember my first interaction with this. For the first part of my career, from ages 13 to approximately 17 or 18, I did a lot of work for hire.
Hmm.
So a company paid me some money, and we agreed on an amount of money, and I wrote some software, and then I willingly said, "You now own this. Now pay me."
Hmm.
Um, and when I started working in the regional economic development agency in government, I was paid a salary for, a 37 and a half hour work week, but I was working 60 hours a week to write a lot of code. And that was outside of my job description. And I do intend to sort of write about this in more detail on my blog. Um, and I remember at one point, the economic development agency that I worked for, which was a fully publicly funded thing with public money, they they first explained to me that they were going to sell one of the websites that I had developed effectively in my spare time because
Hmm.
I did it on a weekend to help out somebody else with their project that was funded by government money. They were going to sell it to a third party. And I said, wait a minute, this is my work. I created this thing, and you are now telling me that you're going to sell it to somebody to profit from because they didn't, because they're going to give you money or whatever. And the whole thing was very complicated because it was private companies exchanging money to buy things from the government and so on and so on and so on. It was very, very complicated. And I was 18 at the time,
Hmm.
19 at the time, so I didn't really understand the ins and outs of it. And one of the sort of older guys in the office said, "Stephen, you wrote this while you worked here, so the agency owns it and they can do whatever they want with it." And I just thought that was complete fucking bullshit, because and that was the first time that I sort of experienced this idea that when I create something that is not a specific, a lot of my work is work for hire. Somebody pays me a thing, and I happily do the thing, and I happily, in exchange for money, give them the rights to the thing that I have created. But in this case, I still felt like I owned the thing that
Hmm.
I had
Hmm.
created because I had created it with government money, public money. I felt that the public owned this thing. And so I did the right thing, and I released the code as GPL. Um, the AGPL didn't exist at the time. Now, that code doesn't exist anymore anywhere where anybody can find it, unfortunately. I never kept a copy. But that was the first time that I sort of realized that I I create a thing and somebody else owns it, even though I never gave them permission to own it, or I didn't
Hmm.
knowingly give them permission to own it. And that was really problematic for me. And I still have regrets about that entire situation, actually.
No, sure.
Um, but I think it was especially complicated because I was I was being paid by, out of public funds
Yeah.
for this thing that I was doing. And so I felt that it should belong to the public. There are subsets of government around the world that say everything we do is free software and we're releasing it in that way. The city of Malmö here in Sweden releases a lot of the stuff that they have that runs the city in various ways as GPL and AGPL
Hmm.
software. It's very hard to take that software and turn it into something that you can use as well. But their opinion at a point in time seemed to be that, look, public money created this, and so the public owns it. And
Yeah,
I think
and
that might be an interesting thing.
yeah, Free Software Foundation of Europe has had a long-running public money, public code um, campaign that has done well
Yes.
with European city governments. Um, and ironically, the US government is actually another sort of example of this. They are not allowed, I think, constitutionally, to claim copyright protection over any of their work. So everything that the US government has ever published is in the public domain. Um,
That would be fantastic. I think that that would be a, you know, sort of a move in the right direction. I think I've complained on this stream before, but one of the current bugs up my arse, two of them. One of them is that to participate in Swedish society, you have to use this proprietary software called Bank ID, which is how you authenticate yourself to everything from the tax office to your um, online banking. Also, you use it to authenticate online purchases. Like I go to a store that I want to buy something from, and I log in with Bank ID, and that's an entirely proprietary system, and that kind of, it's a bug up my arse. But I've also talked about sort of the transit companies that are doing the same thing over and over and over again in different regions of the same country. And so we're spending, you know, 20 times as much money on public transit software in Sweden as we ought to, because we're paying for everything 20 times. And none of that code is open and available to the public. When I think that, you know, one transit company could open their code, and the 19 other transit companies could just use that exact same code. And these things are really ridiculous. Another sort of final thought on this: when I worked in regional government, and one of the main reasons why I left regional government was, and I would like to hear your thoughts on academia, from the academia perspective, if you care to share those or if you have them. When I worked in regional government, there was often, as early as 1999, there was often a question of how do we turn this into a product that we can give to a local business that they can then run, you know, they can then sustain themselves on. And when I was working on projects, I wasn't thinking about how do we turn this into a sustainable business. I was thinking about how do we provide a good service for the government, for the people that live here. And they started productizing things as early as 1999, and it really pissed me off.
So academia in the UK, and I can't, you know, comment on the rest of it. There is a drive towards commercial impact. Now, in some senses, it's a bit better. Like, you know, so you're still kind of basically creating what is called intellectual property for the purpose of like licensing it at a relatively small fee to a startup that can then sell it on for a profit. But typically, the university will keep a stake in that company, and also keeps ownership of the IP, and only licenses it to that company, which has the benefit that it reduces a lot of the other costs of interacting with the university, because that money is augmenting their endowment and, you know, their fees funding and everything else they're getting in order to run the university. So, like, Oxford University has a subsidiary private company called Oxford University Innovations that owns the license pool and effectively invests a tiny fraction of the university's endowment in return for a share of the profits from these private companies. But it certainly does produce, like, conflicting goals in various projects. But anyway, we want to. We're not going to get onto any coding today. We spent an hour and three quarters on.
In the final moments, we should talk about Intro to Objective C.
I want to, yeah, exactly. I want to spend the rest of the stream talking about Adobo Souza's question. Hopefully, they're still here, having asked this question at least an hour ago. What's the easiest way to get started with Objective C in 2021? Resources are scarce, to say the least. What do you think?
I would say that that Objective C is not as much of a moving, the language itself, and Objective C, like most things, is a complex sort of beast. Objective C refers to a programming language, various runtimes that implement the programming language, various operating systems and environments that you can use it on. I would say that as a first approximation, anything you can find on Objective C is still relevant today. and that includes published books. Um, uh, at least one we've talked about on the stream, even though it comes from a publisher that I don't like. Um, and anything that you can find is still as relevant today as it was when it was published. I think even the original stuff on Objective C and Brad Cox's original papers and things like that as well.
Yeah, so on a yeah, I think you're right, and probably the best like sort of tutorial form document for learning Objective C is the Big Nerd Ranch Objective C Programming, the Big Nerd Ranch Guide. If you can
Yep.
find the final edition of that, which would only be 4 or 5 years old, that is going to work exactly the same now as it did when it was published. And you can get yourself a Mac with Xcode, and even follow all the instructions for what buttons you press, or you can get yourself a Linux computer or a FreeBSD computer or whatever, install GNU Step on it, which is incredibly easy, and then you have to like learn how to use the build tools and so on GNU Step, but like learning the Objective C programming language would be the same. And then there isn't really like Objective C itself isn't a very big language in terms of the object oriented stuff like the classes and the objects and method sending and things. Um, what makes it a complex language is C, but there are plenty of good resources on learning the C programming language. My neighbour's cat just came into the house looking for a fight with my cat, and then left when it saw that I was looking.
Fucked
Yeah.
around and found out.
Sorry?
It fucked around and found out.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is I think there's a fairly good book called Modern C Programming, which is another O'Reilly book, but covers like the C11 standard. So yeah, it was modern at the time it was written, but it helps you to kind of avoid a lot of the footgun opportunities that like the C programming language has. But we still have this question of okay, like I've learned Objective C, I've learned what buttons to press in Xcode, but I want to use GNU Step and Linux. I need to understand like GNU Step Make or or Project Center or whatever. And there is a good set of tutorials on that. I'm just going to try typing a URL into Firefox live on the stream and see whether it is the correct. Yes, excellent. Second guess, that wasn't too bad. So this has Beginner's Guide to Objective-C Programming. This has the GNU Step Base Library Programming Manual. This has tutorials on the GNU Step Build Guide. Even on like building web objects, building web objects applications with GNU Step Web and the GNU Step Database Library. Can you stop fucking with the mouse for a second while I just paste this?
Sorry, I saw that it was Firefox and I thought it was mine.
No. So I'm going to paste that into the chat. Amiga Game 1200 says they always go back to the K&R book for C. I think that is dangerous. I have the K&R book probably here. I can see it, but I can't reach it without getting out of my chair, and I'm not going to. The latest edition of the K&R book is from 1991, I think. C has moved on a lot. A lot of the example code in the K&R book doesn't have any idea of like security practices because software security wasn't a big deal in 1991, or as big a deal as it should be. It doesn't use any like sort of modern structures, and as you notice, it doesn't actually tell you how to program with C. It tells you how to use all of the features of the C programming language or of the compiler that they wrote. So it is a good reference if what you have is a really ancient C compiler, like the VBCC on the Amiga from 100 years ago or something. But I certainly wouldn't recommend it as a book to learn about C programming.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also go back to KNRC. I think it's third edition when they first introduced the ANSI stuff, but that's more of a refresher because that's where I know to look. So I don't think that's a good place to start. This website, GNUstep.madeit.com, looks fantastic. There's a lot of really great stuff in there. So I'm actually going to spend some time on this website myself because there's a bunch of stuff there that I need to read and get up to speed on myself. So I think that's a great starting point. I really like I think it's the James Duncan Davidson book that we've used on the stream before.
Learning Cocoa, yeah.
Yeah, Learning Cocoa is pretty good, not for Objective-C specifically, but for Cocoa. And so I would recommend that. And yeah, so but maybe we've identified that there is, room for improvement in this space. And as we learned last stream when we actually did some coding, we learned that the GNU Step documentation is quite good and always improving, thanks in part to us. So so that's also a really good resource as well.
Yeah, and that documentation change that we made actually landed in the previous week. So
that makes me feel good about this stream.
yeah, I mean, what I have noticed is that we've actually got a very small amount of work to do on Simple Agenda before we can park it and move on to something that we're both interested in, which is bundling stuff with geeks. And we're both interested in Simple Agenda as well because we both want to use it as our as our calendar app, and the change we're making will make it much easier to integrate with Nextcloud, which is the thing we're both fans of as well. But I've noticed that we've been sort of revenge procrastinating on this project and not getting started with the coding until very late in the stream. I wonder whether it's keeping us interested enough.
I'm not sure if I think that because this stream aligns so well on the other stream, the sort of free software politics that we both find so interesting don't really come into play in Legaland. But on this stream, we have a lot more, I think, stream relevant content in the free software space that is not necessarily the technical bits. I don't necessarily think that it's a lack of interest as much as it is there's just we have so much more we have so much more that we want to say about the whole space rather than just writing code. And so it is nice when we get those small wins like documentation changes or patches or when Greg shows up and fixes a bug for us. We're making. I think we're making an impact, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that is not necessarily specifically modern Objective-C and modern GNU Step or modern Cocoa programming on free software platforms. I think there's a lot of other stuff. So maybe for next week, we should be a little bit more careful to time box the shit talking part of the stream to 1 hour. And
maybe we should run even shorter next time. Yeah, maybe we should do 20 minutes and then just get a solid 1 hour 20 of coding in.
That also sounds like a good plan.
Or 1 hour 40.
Maybe
I can do maths.
Maybe if the software industry isn't imploding in the time between this stream and the next one, that we have less to talk about.
Yeah.
But
well, we know we've got 6 months. We know we've got 6 months until the FSF come back with their governance recommendations. So that's not going to hit the stream for a long time.
Right, and we also didn't talk about Audacity yet.
Oh shit! Okay, well we got 6 minutes left. Go for it.
I wasn't planning on talking about Audacity today, but I did find it amusing that was sort of on my list. In addition to Copilot, I thought we should talk about Audacity because this also represents another thing where, and actually you have more knowledge about about everything, but you have more knowledge about the entire spectrum that this covers. What happened with Audacity is Audacity, which is free software, GPL2 Plus, I think.
Yeah.
Was
Actually, GPL2 exactly, I think.
Was acquired, but this is a weird fucking thing that happens in the free software community now, that open source projects get acquired. That is a thing that still boggles my mind, and I really need to think about this and understand it better. There's the company. I have never used MuseScore except.
Oh, I have. I really like it. I don't like, they've moved to a clown-based subscription model for some of the features. I don't like that. But the software is great.
Right.
For anyone who's trying to use Sibelius, it's like that, but it doesn't cost thousands of pounds.
So MuseScore I have only used when I've shared things with you that you did in MuseScore.
Right.
And I'm also very new to music. As sort of a thing. And so I'm more interested in these things now. I have used Audacity a lot. Not every day, but I have used Audacity a lot. But what seems to have happened is there's a company that somehow acquired MuseScore, and they call themselves Muse Corp or something like that. Yeah. They also own a website that I wish I didn't pay for a year of subscription to at this point, because I have no way of getting my money back and telling them to go fuck themselves, called ultimateguitar.com. Okay. Ultimateguitar.com is basically GitHub for guitar tabs.
Oh, I didn't know they own that. Well, I mean, it is GitHub in the way that Copilot is GitHub, rather than it is GitHub in the way that SourceForge is GitHub, but yeah.
Right. And I signed up for an account to Ultimate Guitar, and I went in and I fixed some tabs, and I submit my changes back and stuff, and I've sort of have increasing karma on that website, and I thought that it was a community of sort of like-minded people. Muse owns UltimateGuitar.com, MuseScore, and now Audacity. And they released a new version of Audacity that has some telemetry and like creepy shit involved. And they have updated their privacy policy that they will use your data, and also that that Audacity now should not be used by people who are younger than 13 years old, which also fucking pisses me off.
Well, freedom to use software for any purpose, and I don't think they can do that.
Oh, I mean, well, they can't. And so Audacity is in need of a fork.
It has one. There is one called there's an org again on GitHub.
Yeah, you sent me the link today called Temporary Audacity.
Yeah.
Now, you suggested to me that I register the domains for a fork and then abandon the project. And I have definitely done the first part of that, and I have not yet done the second part of that. But I think what I'm going to do, because I think an Audacity fork should be called Inaudacious, and I think my current plan is to contact the people that have made the Audacity fork and tell them and say, look, who do I give this domain to? And please continue your work, and I will help in any way I can. So now, both of my kids are older than age 13. My son is 13. So both of my kids are older than age 12. So my kids are not prevented from using this software. But other people's kids are. And I think that Audacity is one of the programs that is sort of a shining light in the free software community, in that it is free software and it's better than most of the equivalent proprietary software. And I really
a lot of people on Mac still use it, even though GarageBand comes bundled with a Mac, as far as I'm aware.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Audacity is fantastic software. And so this GitHub repo that you posted is very good. So I definitely want to explore this more, but this is a disturbing trend in software land, in free software land, that somehow it makes a lot of sense to me when a company or a group of people make a piece of software and then form a company around that. Nextcloud has a company around it. They deliberately do not have a CLA and stuff like that. Nextcloud is probably the best example of how to run this kind of organization, I think. And I think they're very, Matthew Scala is definitely right. The age limit comes from children's privacy laws in the US. I don't think they are, I don't think it's European related. But Facebook also has the 12, 13, the 13-year-old age limit bullshit as well for the same reasons. But Audacity is one of those pieces of software that needs to be preserved in its freest form because it is best of breed software. And as soon and I don't understand. Sorry, I had a train of thought. I really like when a group of people build a piece of free software and then form a company around it to provide professional services. I do not like the open core model, but I think that it's very valuable when people say, look, we want to work on this full time and we're trying to make money at it so that we can support ourselves, so that we can continue to make the software better. And I really support that. What I don't like is when software is created by a group of people who really care about something, and then some third party comes in and acquires it somehow and then makes it non-free and shitty, even though they weren't involved in the original creation and development of the project. And that is a troubling thing that I have not investigated. I haven't interrogated this line of thinking enough yet to have really strong, reasonable opinions on it yet. But it just really smells bad to me. And this is what the Muse group and the people in it seem to be doing with Audacity, and it really pisses me off.
Yeah, luckily, this is one of the situations where the copyleft is helpful because we still have, not only the versions from before they added this, but now the versions from after someone else has removed it, and so there is still the tracking free Audacity and like child friendly Audacity, and the only. And when I say it is the only difficulty, it is still a big difficulty. Is making sure that people are aware of this version and that they know that it, what its advantages or what its benefits are with respect to the other version.
Right. In the OBS world, which we're both familiar with, there are a few spin-off companies that make sort of shittier versions of OBS, the Open Broadcasting System. There are a couple of spin-off companies that make shittier versions of OBS and try to monetize that and add tracking and so on, Streamlabs being the biggest culprit. But those haven't really... They didn't somehow acquire the OBS project. They established a new separate line of business that most people in the community understand as a less good product. And that is sort of the best case scenario. But in this case, it seems that whoever got the keys to the Audacity website and GitHub repo organization now sort of, for lack of a better word, own it and have and are making it terrible. And that really that is really troubling. And I don't think this is the last. I think this is the I worry that this is the first of these kinds of things that we're going to continue to see for a while.
On that bombshell, thank you very much for watching and for joining in on the chat. We genuinely appreciate it. We will try to write some code next week. We will also try to actually stick to our scheduled time. I'm just going to check my calendar. I believe I have a need to be in Oxford on Wednesday evening, so it might actually be Tuesday next week as well. What's your availability?
That's totally fine for me. My availability in the evenings next week is totally fine. So
Okay, so
it's
probably Tuesday
possible.
next week.
Yeah, it's possible that maybe Tuesday just becomes stream day for this stream, but
Yeah,
we can discuss that later.
yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, well, what I haven't worked out is the free software way to do the notification. I should probably just write a blog post and recommend that you all subscribe to the RSS feed at obc-retain.com. That requires me remembering to post about when we're going live in advance, but that's achievable. Um, that's the easiest way to do it. Okay, well, yeah, so thank you very much. Like I say, probably more code next time, I hope. Please like and
Yes.
subscribe. If you don't want to subscribe, then give us money anyway. Patreon.com/IamLeeG or Patreon.com/SRBaker. And we will see you again some other time.
All right. See you next week. Bye.